Hey, good evening, Maples family, and welcome to our devotion for Monday night, June 14th, 2021. I'm so glad to see the hymnals back in our pews, and I've been looking at hymn number 77 in our United Methodist hymnal, which is How Great Thou Art. I want to talk a little bit today about that very, very, very famous hymn. And the origins of that hymn date all the way back to 1886 by a Swedish pastor named Karl Boberg. And he was a leading evangelist of his day. He was the editor of a very influential Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sweden periodical known as the Sanningsvittnet, which means Witness of the Truth. Now, Boberg served in the Swedish Parliament, and he published just tons of poetry and hymns as well. And if you think about it, hymns are very poetic in nature. He helped compile the very first two hymnals for the Swedish Covenant Church. Now, his inspiration is said to have come one day when he was caught in a thunderstorm on the southeastern coast of Sweden. It was a really, really bad storm, really, really violent storm. And as soon as it was over, the sun came out. And the singing of the birds left him falling to his knees in awe. So he wrote the 9 stanzas of the original version in Swedish, and I'm going to read the Swedish to you. O store Gud, när jag din värld beskatter. Which you can say, O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder. Several years later, Boberg unexpectedly heard his poem sung by a congregation to an old Swedish folk melody. Well, the subsequent history of the poem is pretty unclear, but it is interesting. An earlier literal English translation of 4 of the stanzas by E. Gustav Johnson sometime in the 1920s began, O mighty God, when I behold the wonder. This version never caught on, however, though it might be found in some hymnals. The first stanza and refrain go like this. O mighty God, when I behold the wonder of nature's beauty, wrought by words of thine, and how thou leadest all from realms of yonder, sustaining earthly life in love benign. And then the refrain goes like this. With rapture filled, my soul thy name would laud, O mighty God, O mighty God. With rapture filled, my soul thy name would laud, O mighty God, O mighty God. In 1907, Manfred von Glen, who is a German, he translated the text from Swedish into German, and it became the hymn known as Wie groß bist du. In 1927, there was a Russian version by the evangelical leader Ivan Prokhanov, and it appeared in a collection published by the Baptist Press in Poland. Then, English missionary Stuart K. Hine and his wife heard the Russian version sung as a vocal duet in what was then Ukraine and is now Ukraine. As the Hine couple crossed into the sub-Carpathian Russia, the mountain scenery brought back the memory of that song. And the first 3 stanzas were composed while they were in the Carpathian Mountains. And when war broke out, Hine and his wife were then forced to leave England. This is World War II. They were forced to leave to go to England in 1939. And they used the first 3 stanzas in evangelistic endeavors during what historians called the Blitz years, the years of Nazi occupation. The 4th stanza was actually added after World War II. We move on and we get to a Baptist hymnologist by the name of William Reynolds, who cites comments by George Beverly Shea on the hymn's introduction in the U.S. through the Billy Graham Crusades. He says, we first sang it in the Toronto, Canada Crusade of 1955. Cliff Barrows and his large volunteer choir assisted in the majestic refrains, he says. Soon after, we used it in the Hour of Decision, which are radio broadcasts, and then in the American Crusades. In the New York meetings of 1957, the choir joined me in singing it 93 times. And that's a direct quote from Reynolds. So the first 2 stanzas in hymn number 77 establish the grandeur of God's creation, while the refrain establishes our response, how great thou art. Now in stanza 3, the God of the natural created order continues the creative act by sending God's Son to redeem a lost humanity. With this stanza, the primary theological perspective shifts from creation to then atonement. And while the first two stanzas express humanity's awe at the natural created order, as we discussed earlier, this is not the ultimate goal of this hymn. I want you to hear that. Human sin has marred the gift of the Creator. Now, the vivid description of nature in the first two stanzas finds fulfillment in heaven when we escape the earth. Now, the last stanza, it might be seen as the completion of the story of creation and human redemption on what's known as an eschatological note. The fulfillment of creation takes place in heaven. Therefore, this hymn embodies the breadth of the redemption story all the way from Genesis to Revelation and all the books in between. Given the sweeping and shifting theological territory that's covered in this hymn, the refrain ties all the themes together with the reiteration of the hymn's central premise 4 times, "How great thou art," thus boasting the hymn's title. Now, after an extended court battle to determine the ownership of the text, we live in a world of copyright laws and things like that. Well, this hymn, definitely had its journey through all of that. Hines' English words in his musical setting were assigned to Manna Music. The publisher was able to show that the 1953 version of the gospel hymn was the, and I quote, "the first, final, and fixed form of the hymn." "How Great Thou Art" is this one I found particularly interesting, looking at this hymn 77 in our United Methodist hymnal. "How Great Thou Art" is one of the most expensive hymns to include in a hymnal. Now you may be wondering, what do you mean by expensive? Where does that come from? It cost $2,000 for a permission fee for the United Methodist hymnal. So they had to pay $2,000 just for permission to put it into this hymnal. But in spite of this, you can find a whole bunch of websites that provide the entire text, obviously without the publisher's permission, and as well as the accompanying music. I've heard the hymn sung in Swedish using Boberg's original version. The Swedish version is understated and it is sung in very, very strict rhythm. And that version is no less fervently felt, however, by Swedish Christians. Though versions sung in the Graham Crusades are a vastly different experience from those heard in Sweden. Conducted by Cliff Barrows, the Crusade renditions featured soaring lines with fermatas on the last phrase of the refrain and the resonant bass voice of George Beverly Shea. These were a part of many of our sacred soundscapes. Many of us grew up seeing the televised Crusades, probably in black and white television, and hearing them over and over again on LP vinyl records. Boy, does that take me back. Recordings by numerous popular recording artists might be found on YouTube. A simple Google search for "How Great Thou Art." But in my opinion, none are as memorable as the rendition by Memphis's own Elvis Presley, the King, on his farewell tour that he was on in 1977, just a few weeks prior to his death. It's an absolutely stirring version. I encourage you to YouTube that and look it up. Who would have known that our hymns, especially that one, have such a vibrant history in them? So the next time you crack open a hymnal and you turn to 77, think about what all this has been through. Think about what its meaning is, from the early times to the fall, to Jesus' death and resurrection, and to human salvation. O Lord my God, how great thou art. Thanks for joining me tonight. We'll see you back here again tomorrow night for our Tuesday devotional. Have a great night.